In this lesson, we're going to be talking about password storage, the different ways that passwords are stored in different systems. Passwords, of course, are typically not stored in plain text, and certainly at the operating system level, passwords haven't been stored in plain text in decades. They get stored in typically a one-way hash function. So you would send a plain text password through this one-way hash function that could not be run in reverse in order to get the plain text password back. So you have this hash at the end that the only way to get the plain text password back is to run a series of plain text passwords through the same hash algorithm and compare the hashes to see what worked and what didn't. In other words, whether the hashes match or not. Let's talk first about Windows and how Windows stores their passwords. Windows stores their passwords in SAM, which is the Security Accounts Manager, and it's stored in hashed format. With NT 4.0, Microsoft actually started to do partial encryptions of their database using this mechanism called syskey. However, we could do things like grabbing the passwords out of SAM using something like Cain-Enable. So you can see there's a password here that Cain-Enable has grabbed. We can also go into protective storage and see what we can get out of there. And in this case, it didn't actually find anything. But Cain-Enable has the ability to pull passwords that are stored locally from Windows. There's another utility called pwdump7. You can find this available for download. I can run pwdump7 here, and you can see that I've got administrator and guest, and it looks like that's the hash there, and guest has nothing at all. So that's a couple of different ways that even though Windows protects their password database, you still have the ability to go pull some information out of it. And then once you have that information, you can start running your password cracking attempts at it. Now, on the Unix-like side, for years, there has been a password file, and it's stored in the directory etc or etc. If I take a look at etc password, I'm going to see all of the users that are on this system. However, we don't see any passwords. So I can take a look at the password file where the actual passwords are stored. Except that I can't, because that requires administrative privileges to look at the shadow file, and the shadow file is where all of the hashed passwords are actually stored. So I have to have administrative privileges, and I can look at the shadow file, and you can see for most of these users, it doesn't actually have a password anywhere. There are a couple of users that have passwords, but the shadow file is where the passwords are actually stored on Linux and Unix systems. They're just plain text files or flat files, and they're stored in a tabular form where you have different fields corresponding to different things like a username, password, user ID, group ID, and that sort of information. A Unix-like system, though, that doesn't store your passwords that way is macOS. And if I go looking for the password file, there's one there. If I go looking for the shadow file, there's no such file as shadow. And that's because with macOS, Apple uses something called Apple Open Directory, which is an LDAP implementation, and that stores user data. So even though there's an etc password file, the user data, including the password, is actually stored in this LDAP format called Apple Open Directory. And that's how different operating systems store passwords in different ways.